Here is what I know about prices. In 1934, when I was 15 years old, and working beside my father in his shop on 86th Street, a man would bring in a pair of work boots and ask what it cost to resole them. My father would look at the boots, turn them over, press the leather, check the welt, and he would give a number, never high, never low, what the work was actually worth. And sometimes the man would flinch. Sometimes he'd say, "That's more than I expected." And my father would say the same thing every time, in his broken English that got a little less broken every year. That is the price. The price does not change because you do not like it. He meant it kindly. He wasn't a hard man. He just believed, genuinely believed, the way immigrants who came from nothing tend to believe things, that an honest number, stated plainly, was a form of respect. That telling someone what something actually cost was the most decent thing you could do for them. Not the number that would make them feel better, the number that was true. I thought about my father this week. The Pentagon just told Congress it needs $200 billion. On top of the $1 trillion it already gets every year. On top of the $16.5 billion already spent in 12 days. On top of the $3.7 billion burned through in the first 100 hours before most Americans had finished their Monday morning coffee. The man at the podium, Defense Secretary Hegseth, said it takes money to kill bad guys, and moved on to the next question. 5 words. No spreadsheet, no line items, no breakdown of what the $200 billion was for beyond the general category of killing and replenishing. My father would have had something to say about that, probably in Italian, and probably not fit for this particular audience. Let me give you the tag number first, and then I want to tell you what's on the back. The tag, Kevin Hassett, the President's own director of the National Economic Council, not a critic, not a partisan, said Sunday that the war has already cost $12 billion in its first 18 days. The Center for Strategic and International Studies, which exists specifically to track these things, puts the first 12 days at $16.5 billion. Before a single strike on February 28th, the military had spent $630 million just repositioning, moving carrier groups, moving aircraft, moving 50,000 people into place across the region. That is the cover charge. That is what it costs just to show up to this particular argument. The $200 billion supplemental request is now sitting at the White House waiting to go to Congress. Hegseth said the number could move. It always moves in one direction. Here is a number that may help you understand the size of what's being asked. $200 billion. The extra ask, the bonus round, not the base budget, is larger than the entire annual defense spending of every country on earth except the United States. Not most countries, every country. Russia, China, the entire NATO alliance nearly. What Hegseth is requesting in addition to the normal budget is more than what any other nation on earth spends in a year to defend itself. That is the tag number. Now let me tell you about the back of the bill, because that is where the real education lives, and that is where this country has a long and consistent and almost perfect record of not looking. I want to introduce you to a man named Lawrence Lindsay. You probably don't know him. In 2002, Lindsay was the chief economic advisor to President George W. Bush. Harvard trained, well regarded, a serious man in a serious job at a serious moment. And in the fall of 2002, while the administration was building the case for the invasion of Iraq, Lindsay did something that cost him his career. He told the truth. He said the war might cost between $100 billion and $200 billion. The White House reacted immediately. The Office of Management and Budget went to the press with a different number, $50 to $60 billion, in and out, short war, manageable. Lindsay's estimate, they said, was far too high, alarmist, unhelpful. He was gone a few months later, resigned officially, the way people in Washington are always officially resigning when they are being shown the door. He was wrong too, just not in the direction they said. He was wrong because his estimate was 15 times too small. A Nobel Prize-winning economist named Joseph Stiglitz and his colleague Linda Bilmes at Harvard's Kennedy School spent years after the war tracking every dollar, every contract, every appropriation, every supplemental funding request, every line item that showed up in any ledger that could be connected, directly or indirectly, to the decision made in 2003. Their conclusion, published in a book in 2008, was that the Iraq War cost $3 trillion. $3 trillion. And in the same book, in the same breath, they wrote, even that is probably too low. Too low. The man who said $100 billion lost his job. The people who said $50 billion were in charge of the war. The people who eventually counted $3 trillion said they were still undercounting. I want you to sit with that sequence for a moment before I continue, because it is not an accident. It is a pattern, and the pattern is exactly as old as the government's habit of going to war. The $3 trillion, as staggering as that number is, was the visible part of the bill. It was the part that showed up in defense appropriations and weapons contracts and military fuel invoices and the salaries of the 140,000 troops deployed at the peak. The part that, with enough digging, a determined researcher could find in a government ledger somewhere. Numbers have a way of existing on paper even when nobody wants to discuss them. The invisible part of the bill, the part that doesn't appear at press briefings, the part that the $50 billion estimate of 2002 could not have imagined, and did not try to, is what you owe the people you send. Veterans care for the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. Medical treatment, disability claims, mental health support, the lifetime of obligations a nation accumulates the moment it puts a 22-year-old in harm's way. That number is now projected by Bilmes at Harvard using the most careful methodology she could construct to reach between $2.2 and $2.5 trillion by the year 2050, 24 years from now. We started those wars in 2001 and 2003. We are in 2026. The bills are still arriving. The men and women who came home and seemed intact at 23 are now 42, and the body is a meticulous accountant, and it is presenting invoices that nobody planned for, and nobody budgeted, and nobody put in the $50 billion estimate that was handed to Congress in 2002. Federal spending on veterans doubled from 2.4% of the entire federal budget in 2001 to nearly 5% by 2020. This happened while the total number of living veterans from all of America's wars was actually going down. Fewer veterans in total, each one costing more, because we got better at keeping people alive in conditions that would have killed them in previous wars. The body armor improved. The battlefield medicine improved. Survival rates went up, which is good. Of course it is good. A man who survives is a man who comes home to his family. But survival is not the end of the cost. Survival is the beginning of a different chapter, and that chapter is long, and it is expensive, and it does not appear in the original estimate. And then there is the layer underneath that one. We did not raise taxes to pay for Iraq and Afghanistan. I want to be careful here because I am not making a political argument. I am stating a historical fact that economists and budget analysts across the political spectrum agree on. In previous generations, when America went to war, Americans were asked to participate in the financial sacrifice directly. War bonds in the 1940s, tax adjustments during Korea. Vietnam was funded in part through explicit revenue measures, even as the war divided the country. Iraq and Afghanistan were put on a credit card and handed to the future. The interest on the money borrowed to fight those two wars, according to analysis from Harvard and the Project on Government Oversight, could reach $7 trillion. $7 trillion. in interest for two wars whose combined initial price tags were presented to the public as something between 50 billion and, if you were Lawrence Lindsay and willing to lose your job over it, $200 billion. Now we are 22 days into a new one, and the Pentagon is asking for $200 billion before the first month is out. I grew up watching my father keep a ledger for his shop. Every Friday evening, after the last customer left and before he locked up, he would sit at the workbench with his ledger and his pencil, and he would balance the books. What came in, what went out, what was owed and to whom, and by when. He did this without fail for 30 years. He used to say, "A man who doesn't know what he owes is not a free man." He is a man who has signed a contract he has not read. I think about that sentence a great deal these days. I need to stop here and tell you something that has nothing to do with economics, because the economics only make sense if you understand what the numbers are actually measuring. I want to tell you about a man named Sal Ferrante. Yes, another Sal. It was a common name in that part of Brooklyn. And we were not a people known for variety in our naming conventions. Ferrante lived on the 4th floor of my building on Benson Avenue. He had been a baker before the war. Cheerful, flowery-smelling man who used to leave extra bread outside neighbors' doors on Saturday mornings because the oven was already hot and he had more than he needed. He came home from the Pacific in 1945 and he went back to baking. On the surface, nothing was different. But I used to see him in the building's courtyard at 2 and 3 in the morning, just sitting, not doing anything visible, no book, no cigarette, nothing, just sitting in the dark because he could not sleep. His wife Conchetta would come down after him, quiet as she could manage on the stairs, and she would sit beside him for a while and then take him by the hand and lead him back up. This happened for years. I witnessed it dozens of times before I moved away. I do not know how long it continued after that. Nobody called it anything then. The VA was new, created specifically for this generation, and it was overwhelmed. And the visible wounds, the physical ones, were the priority. The invisible ones were acknowledged mostly by not being mentioned. Now we have words: PTSD, traumatic brain injury, moral injury. That last one I learned recently, the specific damage that comes not from fear, but from being asked to do things that conflict with what you believe is right. Each of these has a name now. Each of these has, buried somewhere in a congressional appropriation, a dollar figure attached to it. And here is what I want you to understand. Sal Ferrante's 2 in the morning courtyard visits were never in any budget. Conchetta's years of walking quietly downstairs, sitting in the dark, and walking her husband back upstairs, that was not in any estimate. The cost was real. It was paid every night by those 2 people. And the ledger that recorded it was kept only in the way that families keep ledgers, in the texture of a life, in the shape of a marriage, in the kind of man their children understood their father to be. That is what a war costs. Not just the number they put on the podium. Now his son Mario. Mario Ferrante was born in 1947, 2 years after his father came home. He grew up in that building, knowing his father as a quiet man who made good bread and could not sleep. Mario went to Vietnam in 1968, enlisted rather than waited to be drafted, which was its own kind of statement about a young man's relationship to control, and came back in 1970. He was fine, mostly. He worked for the city for 30 years after that. Sanitation department, good union job, good pension. He raised a family. By most measures, a successful life. But his daughter Diane told me something years later when she came into my shop as a grown woman to get a pair of shoes resoled. She said her father never went to parades, not even the kind that had nothing to do with the military, street fairs, block parties, anything with crowds and noise and flags. He would find a reason to be somewhere else. He never explained it, he just didn't go. And Diane had grown up absorbing this without understanding it, the way children absorb their parents' shapes and call it normal. It wasn't until she was an adult, a nurse by then, that she started to understand what she had been living inside. The thread that ran from her grandfather sitting in the courtyard at 2 a.m. to her father's absence from every public celebration in her childhood. 2 generations, 2 wars, 1 apartment building in Brooklyn, and a texture of life that was shaped by costs that never appeared in any congressional testimony. Diane asked me, "Does it ever end?" I said, "The visible parts end. The contracts get paid eventually. The interest compounds and eventually gets addressed. The formal obligations close out. But the thread, the invisible stuff that runs through the families, the habits that become inheritance, that doesn't go in a budget. And it doesn't end on anyone else's schedule. It just slowly, gradually, over generations, becomes part of what the neighborhood is made of. Part of the weight that sits inside ordinary life without anyone being able to point to exactly where it came from. That is what a war costs. Not just the number at the podium, the thread. There is something else nobody is talking about, and I want to get to it before I give you the other side's argument, because it matters in a way that has nothing to do with whether you support this war or oppose it. Congress has not voted to authorize it. 50,000 American troops are deployed in the region. The military has struck more than 7,800 targets inside Iran in 22 days. 6 service members have already died, killed in a refueling plane crash in Iraq. The Pentagon is asking for $200 billion. and the constitutional mechanism that is supposed to sit between a president and a war, the debate, the vote, the formal authorization by the people's elected representatives, has not happened. I am not a lawyer. I was never much interested in the law as a profession, though I had one son who became one, and I respected the work even when I teased him about it. But I have been an American citizen since 1940, and I have been paying attention to this country's relationship with its own founding documents for 86 years. And I know that the mechanism exists for a reason. It exists because the men who designed this system had read their history. They knew what happened when one person, however competent, however well-intentioned, held the power to commit a nation's blood and treasure without accountability. They had watched kings do it. They had watched the debt those kings accumulated fall on the people who had no voice in the decision. They built the authorization requirement specifically to force the question into the open, to require that someone stand up and say, "This is what it costs. This is what we are doing. This is why we believe it is worth it," and then let the people's representatives respond. Some members of the president's own party are already asking for that accounting. Roger Marshall, Republican of Kansas, said $200 billion sounds like a high number, and that the administration needs to explain what it's for before Congress can consider it. Chip Roy of Texas said the administration has a whole lot more explaining to do. Lauren Boebert of Colorado said plainly, "I am a no. I have already told leadership I am a no on any war supplemental." Thomas Massey asked the question that is sitting underneath all of this. Is this the first $200 billion? Does this turn into $1 trillion? These are not people who oppose war on principle. Some of them have supported military action in other contexts. They are people who understand what it means to sign a check for $200 billion without knowing what it's for, or how long it commits the country to something it cannot easily exit. When my father gave a price for a resoling job, the customer could agree or walk away. They had a choice. They were not presented with a bill after the work was already done and told, "This is what it cost. And by the way, the total will be higher in 20 years once we account for the parts we couldn't see yet." The $200 billion is being presented to Congress after the war started, after the money has already been spent at $1 billion a day, after the commitments have already been made. The authorization that was supposed to happen before any of this, the debate, the vote, the accounting, is being requested in arrears, if at all. I am not telling you the war is wrong. I am telling you that spending money you haven't counted on a war you haven't authorized, based on objectives that have shifted 3 times in 3 weeks, is a pattern I have seen before. It does not tend to end with the first number. Now, here is the honest version of the argument on the other side, because I am old enough to know that any man who only tells you one side of a thing is selling something. The argument for this war, the real one, not the emotional one, not the patriotic one, but the cold, hard, strategic one, goes like this. The Strait of Hormuz carries 20 million barrels of oil a day in normal times. Since February 28th, ship traffic through that strait has dropped from a historical average of 138 transits a day to approximately 5. 5 ships a day through a waterway that is supposed to look like a highway. S&P Global has modeled what happens if this continues. If Brent crude reaches $200 a barrel and stays there, Germany tips into recession. Japan tips into recession. The United Kingdom likely follows. The effects ripple through every economy connected to global energy markets, which is every economy on Earth. The WTO has already said that sustained high oil prices could reduce projected global GDP growth by 0.3%, which sounds small until you understand that 0.3% of global GDP is measured in trillions of dollars of economic activity that simply does not happen. The argument says $200 billion is the cheap version of this problem. The expensive version is a world where any hostile government, sufficiently determined, can close the most important commercial waterway in human history at a cost to themselves that is manageable, with consequences to everyone else that are catastrophic and face no serious response. That argument is not stupid. It is made by serious people who have done the math and believe, genuinely believe, that the cost of not acting is higher than the cost of acting. I do not dismiss it. I have turned it over carefully, in the way that a man who has watched enough of these arguments play out tends to turn things over. Here is where I land. The argument is right about the stakes. The strait matters. The oil matters. A world in which that choke point can be held hostage is genuinely more dangerous and more expensive than a world in which it cannot. What the argument cannot tell me, what no one at any podium has been able to tell me, is whether the $200 billion is a ceiling or a floor, whether the objectives are achievable in the time frame implied, whether the 50,000 troops currently deployed around the region will come home in months or in years, or in some version of the arrangement that has defined American military presence in the Middle East for the last 25 years. Lawrence Lindsay thought the Iraq War would cost $100 to $200 billion. He was the pessimist in the room. He was wrong by a factor of 15. The man who replaced him said $50 billion. I do not know what the right number is for this war. Neither does anyone who is publicly willing to say a number. What I know is that the pattern, the consistent, documented, bipartisan pattern of the first number being the smallest number and the real number arriving years later in a form nobody is politically positioned to acknowledge, that pattern has not been broken in my lifetime, not once. I am 106 years old. This is the part where I am supposed to tell you what that means for the credibility of everything I just said. The idea being that a century of observation earns a certain kind of authority. I want to be honest with you about what it actually earns. It earns the right to say, I have seen this movie. Not this specific war. I did not know in 1941 that I was watching a pattern that would repeat in Korea and Vietnam and Iraq and Afghanistan and now here in a strait I did not know the name of until I was well into my 80s. But the shape of it, the way the first number is stated with confidence, and the second number arrives quietly in a footnote years after the people who gave you the first number have moved on to other things. It earns the right to tell you about Sal Ferrante in the courtyard, and Diane the nurse, and the thread that runs through families long after the formal accounting is complete. It earns the right to tell you that my father was right. The price does not change because you do not like it. And the longer you pretend the tag price is the real price, the more the back of the bill accumulates interest. Somewhere in Washington right now, someone knows what this war will actually cost. Not the $200 billion, the real number, the 20-year number, the veterans number, the interest number, the Diane who grew up without parades number. I hope they are not afraid to say it out loud, and I hope someone is listening when they do.